A single mom walks into work with her silent daughter, a child who hasn't spoken in years. Moments later, the daughter sees Big Shaq, runs into his arms, and whispers one word that stops the world: Dad. He's not her father, but in that one breath, something ancient awakens. A bond beyond blood, a calling neither of them saw coming. She didn't mistake him. She chose him. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The morning buzz of the Jefferson Heights Community Center carried the rhythm of a place stitched together by routine and quiet resilience. Kids laughed faintly down the hallways, staff bustled with clipboards, and the smell of cafeteria pancakes still lingered in the air. Posters about food drives and mentorship programs lined the faded beige walls, and at the heart of it all stood a man whose presence made rooms pause. Shaquille Big Shaq O'Neal wasn't the kind of man you just worked for. He was the kind you remembered. Towering in both stature and spirit, Shaq had long ago traded NBA arenas for basketball courts, where the hoops had rust, where sneakers were taped at the soles, and where kids needed someone to believe in them more than they needed another celebrity. This was his kingdom now, not built on fame, but on foundation grants, second chances and conversations that started with "I've been where you are." This morning he greeted every employee with a fist bump, and his signature booming, "Good morning, family." His voice was gravel wrapped in honey, laced with the kind of warmth that didn't need to prove itself. He wasn't here for image. He was here because he knew what it meant to be unseen. At the front desk, a new face stood behind a refurbished computer monitor. Delilah Carr, mid-30s, with tired eyes and a braided bun that whispered practicality over vanity. She'd started her shift 15 minutes early, partly from nerves, partly because her daughter Sophie had been up since 5, humming to herself in a language only Delilah understood. Delilah's hands shook slightly as she signed her onboarding paperwork. She glanced down at Sophie, who sat cross-legged on the floor beside her, silently coloring in a battered notebook. Sophie was 5, thin as a whisper, with deep brown eyes that carried storms too large for her frame. Her curls bounced as she leaned forward, tongue peeking out in concentration, as she shaded in a drawing of a giant holding hands with a little girl. The giant was smiling. The supervisor, Tanya, had offered a breakroom tour earlier, but Delilah had politely declined. She preferred blending in. She preferred not having to explain that Sophie didn't talk. Not to teachers, not to doctors, not even to Delilah's closest friends. After a daycare incident when Sophie was 3, she'd gone silent. Not mute, just locked away behind some unseen door. Therapists called it selective mutism. Delilah called it heartbreak with no exit. Delilah didn't want her daughter here. She wanted her in a classroom, with other kids, with laughter. But childcare waitlists were brutal, and the bills had made themselves at home. So here they were, starting over again, hoping this job would be different. As Delilah turned her back for just a minute to speak with Tanya, Sophie stood. No sound, no warning, just the quiet rustle of her sneakers on tile as she wandered away, clutching her notebook. The break room was a modest space. Round tables, a humming vending machine, and a coffee maker that moaned like it hated its job. Shaq stood near the counter, stirring a cup of tea. Chamomile, his mom's favorite. He didn't hear the door creak open. He didn't see the little figure step into the room until she was standing just a few feet away, her eyes wide and locked onto his face. He turned slowly, a smile already forming. One of those instinctual, reassuring smiles adults give children when they stumble into the wrong room. But Sophie didn't turn back. She didn't look confused or afraid. She looked certain. Then, without a word, she stepped forward. Her tiny arms wrapped around Shaq's leg, her cheek pressed into his jeans. Her little body trembled, not in fear, but in relief. And then she whispered it. Just one word, just one breath of air that shattered the stillness. "Dad?" Shaq froze. The spoon in his hand clinked to the floor, forgotten. His throat dried, his heart a fortress that had withstood loss, scrutiny, and the noise of fame, cracked in the silence of that single word. Behind them, Tanya gasped, nearly dropping her clipboard. Delilah's heels clicked down the hallway. She called out, "Sophie? Sophie?" her voice tight with fear. When she entered the break room, she stopped cold. There was her daughter, arms around a man she barely knew. A man she had never seen Sophie touch, much less speak to. And there it was again, the word Delilah had dreamed of hearing from her daughter's lips, but never like this. Dad? Sophie said again. Louder this time. With intention. Delilah's hand went to her mouth. Oh my God. Shaq knelt slowly, gently. He was still processing, eyes searching Sophie's for meaning. Hey. Now, sweetheart, he said softly. I think you got the wrong guy. Sophie didn't let go. She looked into his face like it was a map she'd memorized long ago. Delilah dropped to her knees beside them, hands on her daughter's shoulders. Sophie, baby, he's not. He's Mr. Shaq. Remember? Mommy told you he's my boss. He's nice, but… Shaq raised a hand gently. It's all right. He turned to Sophie. You don't talk much, huh? Sophie blinked once. Shaq looked up at Delilah, his voice more gravel than honey now. You said she doesn't speak. Delilah nodded, barely audible. She hasn't. Not since she was 3. Shaq sat back, his large frame somehow folding into stillness. He looked down at Sophie. Why me, kid? Silence again. But this time, it was charged. Intentional. Then Sophie did something else she hadn't done in years. She opened her notebook, flipped to a page, and handed it to Shaq. It was a drawing. A huge man, like a giant, with kind eyes and broad shoulders. Beside him, a little girl with a red bow. The same red bow Sophie wore today. They were holding hands, above the drawing, in shaky pencil lines. One word. Dad. Delilah choked on a sob. She draws him. She's drawn him before. I just thought. Her voice broke. I thought it was just something she imagined. Shaq stared at the page, then at the girl still clinging to him. A chill crept through him, not from fear, but from recognition he couldn't place. Something old, something unfinished, brushed against the edge of his memory. He touched the drawing with one thick finger. I don't know what this is, he said softly, but it ain't just a mix-up. Delilah nodded, tears streaking down her cheeks. Tanya stepped back, giving them space. Her clipboard forgotten. Sophie finally released her hold. She stepped back, looked at both adults, then took her notebook and went to sit quietly at the table. She began coloring again, like nothing had happened, but her lips curled into the faintest, almost private smile. Shaq stood slowly, still watching her like a man who'd seen a ghost that smiled back. He turned to Delilah. You okay? He asked. No, she said honestly. Not even close. Shaq chuckled once. A short, stunned sound. Me neither. They stood in silence, listening to the scratch of crayons on paper, the distant murmur of kids playing down the hallway, and the sound of something impossible taking root in the middle of an ordinary morning. And so it began, not with a headline or a scandal, not with confrontation or confession, but with a whisper in a break room, and a little girl who broke her silence not for her mother, not for a doctor, but for a stranger who somehow already felt like home. And in that moment, whether he knew it or not, Shaq had just stepped into the most important role of his life. Not legend, not hero, not savior, just dad. Delilah sat on the edge of the bench outside the community center's side garden, hands tightly clasped, staring at her shoes as if they might explain everything. Her heart hadn't slowed since the moment Sophie called that man dad. The image kept replaying, over and over, Sophie's small arms wrapping around Shaquille O'Neal like he was the safest place she'd ever known. Her lips forming a word Delilah thought had been locked away forever. Inside, Shaq stood in the break room longer than he realized. The warmth of Sophie's tiny arms lingered on his leg like a memory that refused to fade. He looked at the child's drawing again. That word, that smile, and those eyes, not the ones drawn, but the ones Sophie had looked up at him with. Eyes that weren't confused. They were remembering. Tanya returned with a glass of water, placing it gently on the table. I don't know what just happened, she said quietly, but I think you need to talk to Delilah. Shaq nodded slowly, folding the drawing and placing it in the inside pocket of his hoodie. When he stepped out into the side garden, Delilah didn't look up. She heard the gravel crunch under his weight, heard the bench creak as he sat beside her, but kept her eyes locked on the concrete path ahead. I'm sorry, she said softly, before he could speak. I didn't mean for any of that to happen. She's never done that before, never said a word to anyone. It wasn't staged. I swear. I know, Shaq said, his voice lower. Slower. I believe you. She turned to face him, eyes rimmed red, voice trembling. You don't understand, Sophie hasn't spoken since she was 3. Not a word. No matter what we tried. Therapy, art, music, medication, nothing. And then today, you. She broke off, swallowing her emotion. Shaq studied her for a beat, then asked the question quietly, carefully. What happened to her? Delilah looked away. For a moment she debated. To say it aloud meant to own it again. To relive it. But something in Shaq's presence, his stillness, his unspoken patience, made her believe this might be a safe place. It was daycare, she said. Private place. Expensive. I thought it meant safe. I was wrong. Shaq didn't speak. Just listened. There was a man on staff. Delilah continued. Voice stiff. Not a teacher. Maintenance. I think. One day Sophie spilled juice on her shoes. She told me that he grabbed her wrist and yelled. She said he shook her and called her stupid. Said she wasn't worth the money her mom paid. Shaq closed his eyes for a beat. Delilah's hands twisted in her lap. I only found out because she had a bruise. I pulled her out immediately. Filed a report. But there were no cameras in that room. And the man denied everything. They said it was inconclusive. I couldn't prove it. The next day, Sophie stopped speaking. She stopped laughing. She stopped being. Shaq exhaled slowly. And she never spoke again? Delilah shook her head. Only in her sleep, sometimes. Or when she's drawing, she hums. But words? No, not one. Until today. They sat in silence. The buzz of city life played faint in the distance. Cars whooshing by, birds rustling in the hedges. It should have been a peaceful moment, but there was too much humming beneath the surface. Too many thoughts unspoken. Shaq finally said. She said, Dad. Delilah nodded, arms folding over herself. I know. Why me? Delilah looked at him, eyes narrowing with a hint of confusion. What do you mean? I mean, he gestured vaguely. What is it about me? I'm not exactly the easiest guy to confuse with someone else. I've been asking myself the same thing. Delilah turned and looked toward the window, where Sophie sat in the break room, legs swinging off a chair, quietly coloring. She's drawn that figure before. A tall man, big hands, always smiling. I just assumed it was made up, a kind of imaginary comfort. Shaq leaned back on the bench, hands resting on his knees. She ever had any father figure around? Uncle? Grandpa? Delilah shook her head. No. My mom helped out when Sophie was younger, but she passed away last year. Sophie's never met her biological father. He left before I even told him I was pregnant. I don't think she even has a concept of what a dad really is. That word hovered between them, like a ghost neither wanted to fully confront. Shaq glanced toward the window again. Sophie looked up, saw him, and smiled. It wasn't a shy smile. It was like recognition, like she knew him, not just today, but always. I've seen that look before, Shaq murmured. Delilah tilted her head. Where? He took a breath. In the mirror. When I met my old man for the first time, I was already grown. Didn't need a dad. Didn't even want one. But I still looked at him like he was the answer to a question I didn't know I'd been asking. Delilah's face softened. And was he? No, Shaq said quietly. But I became the answer for someone else later. They sat for a few more moments before Delilah stood up. I should get back to work. I don't want to start off being the woman who cried on the clock. Shaq stood too, hands stuffed into his hoodie pockets. You're not just any woman. You're her mother. That kid's got a light in her, even if it's buried. She spoke because she felt something. That's worth exploring. Delilah turned back as she opened the door. So what now? Shaq met her gaze evenly. Now? I think we figure this out. Together. Inside the break room, Sophie didn't even flinch when they entered. She looked up, then down at her drawing, flipping to a new page. This time she drew herself and Shaq sitting side by side on a bench. The bench looked like the one in the garden. Shaq watched her for a moment, before speaking. Hey Sophie, mind if I sit with you? She didn't respond, but she patted the empty chair beside her. He smiled. I'll take that as a yes. Delilah watched from the doorway, something unspoken passing through her, as she saw her daughter welcome someone. Truly welcome someone for the first time in years. Later that afternoon, as the center settled into its rhythm, whispers began to circulate. Staff members had seen the moment in the break room. Some smiled quietly. Others exchanged looks, curious, uncertain. One of the senior volunteers, Ben, approached Shaq in the hallway. "Heard you got yourself a little shadow today," Ben said with a grin. Shaq chuckled. "Yeah, seems I did." "She talk?" Shaq hesitated, then nodded once. "To me, yeah. First time in 2 years, they say." Ben whistled low. "Damn. That's something, man." "Yeah," Shaq said, his voice dropping. "That's exactly what it is." He returned to his office but didn't stay long. Something compelled him back to the break room. Sophie was gone, but her drawing remained on the table. This time, the two figures were holding microphones. Above them, a caption in childish scrawl. "We talk now." Shaq sat in the empty room, holding the drawing, staring at those 3 words, until the sun dipped just enough to cast long shadows across the floor. That night, when he got home, he placed the drawing on his kitchen counter. It sat beside old photos, championship memorabilia, and plaques from charity events. But this drawing, this paper with crayon and hope, felt more meaningful than any of them. He didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if Sophie would speak again tomorrow, or if this was a one-time miracle. But he knew one thing for certain. Whatever unlocked her silence, whether it was fate, memory, or something deeper, it had found its way through him. And that meant something. Maybe everything. And he wasn't going to walk away from that. Not now. Not ever. Shaq hadn't driven through his mother's neighborhood in months. Maybe longer. The hum of his SUV was steady, but his thoughts were anything but. Sophie's voice, that fragile, trembling dad, kept playing back in his mind, like a needle stuck in the groove of a record, impossible to skip. He pulled into the driveway of the modest single-story house, nestled between 2 overgrown lawns. The paint had chipped more since his last visit, and the porch light flickered with its usual stubborn rhythm. Lucille O'Neill had refused to move, no matter how many homes or estates Shaq offered. This was her domain, and she ran it with the pride of a queen whose castle didn't need marble floors to feel mighty. She was already at the door before he knocked, wearing her robe, a house slipper missing its sole, and a stern look that broke the moment she saw his face. "You look tired," she said, stepping aside to let him in. "I feel tired," he replied. "You hungry?" "Not yet."
That meant yes. It always had.
She disappeared into the kitchen without another word. The scent of collard greens and smoked turkey necks was already in the air. Her way of loving had always been simple. Feed him, listen, and remind him where he came from. He sat on the couch, resting his elbows on his knees, watching the photos on the wall. Him at 8 with a cracked front tooth. Him at 15, awkward and tall. Him at 22, arms raised after a dunk. The crowd in a blur behind him, and scattered between the images of his life were photos of people he barely remembered. Cousins, uncles, distant relatives, fragments of stories he'd never fully pieced together. Lucille returned, wiping her hands on a dish towel, and sat across from him. She didn't speak right away. She didn't need to. "There's a little girl at the center," Shaq finally said. "Sophie, 5 years old. Brown eyes. Skinny thing. Walks quiet. Doesn't talk." Lucille raised an eyebrow. "So why are you talking about her?" "She hugged me," he said. "Called me dad." Lucille's lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. She's never spoken to anyone before. Not since she was 3. Her mother said she just stopped. But today when she saw me, she ran up, wrapped her arms around my leg like she'd done it 100 times before, and said it, "Dad," like she knew. He looked at his mother then, like he expected her to have an answer he couldn't find on his own. Lucille folded her hands in her lap. "And what are you feeling?" "That I've seen those eyes before. Not just hers. Her mama's too. I can't explain it. It's like memory, but foggy. Like music you know the lyrics to but can't place where you first heard it." Lucille leaned forward. "Is the mother someone you've known?" Shaq exhaled. "Delilah Carr. Name doesn't ring a bell, but there's something about her. The way she walks, the way she looks at me, like she's trying not to remember something she's already decided to forget." Lucille said nothing, watching her son's face like a map she'd read all her life. Shaq's voice dropped lower. "There was someone, long time ago, before the money, before the lights. I was 20, maybe 21. She was older, mid-20s, worked at a local center, like ours. We talked a few times, connected on some deep stuff. I was raw back then, still dealing with dad leaving, still trying to act tough, but inside, I was a mess. Lucille's eyes softened. She told me one night that she was leaving. Said she had to go. Said she couldn't stay in a place that wouldn't be safe for a child. I didn't even know she was pregnant. I never saw her again. He rubbed the back of his neck, fingers trailing old tension. I never knew if she meant my child, he continued. I didn't even know her full name. It was just a moment, one I buried. Lucille leaned back in her chair, folding her arms. Do you think this little girl could be yours? Shaq paused for a long time. I don't know. Timeline's messy. Delilah's too young to be the woman from back then. But maybe the child was raised by someone else. Maybe Delilah's her daughter and Sophie's her granddaughter. Or maybe I'm just making things up because I want it to mean something. Lucille didn't smile. Her voice was steady. You've always had a soft spot for the ones who needed what you didn't get. That's not it, Shaq said quickly. Isn't it? She asked gently. All your life you've been trying to be the father you never had. Maybe this girl, maybe she didn't call you dad because she thought you were someone else. Maybe she called you dad because you feel like what a father should be. Shaq stared at the coffee table, the words sinking deep. She broke her silence, he murmured. She said that one word to me, and now she won't leave my side. She drew me, wrote it down. Dad. It's like she saw something in me she trusted. Lucille nodded slowly. Sometimes kids see clearer than grown folks. They don't need DNA to know who's safe. Shaq's eyes flicked toward the old clock on the wall. Time had a way of creeping in Lucille's house. Slow, unbothered. I don't know what to do, Ma. If I lean in, people start talking. If I step back, I'm abandoning her. Either way, I lose. Lucille stood and walked to the window. The streetlight outside flickered like always. Her voice was calm. You've always been afraid of getting close, Shaq. Even when you smile for cameras, there's a part of you that don't let people in. Maybe this is about more than her. Maybe this is about what you're still running from. Shaq didn't respond right away. She sees something in you, she said. And maybe it's time you look close and see if you see it too. Shaq left not long after. Lucille packed him a container of food. As always, he kissed her forehead, held her tight, and said nothing more about Sophie. But as he drove back through the quiet streets, his mind raced. He thought about Delilah's face, guarded, worn, but brave. He thought about Sophie's notebook, that picture of the two of them on the bench, that single word scrawled underneath. He thought about the idea of fate, not the kind you plan, but the kind that sneaks up and taps you on the shoulder in the middle of your ordinary life, and whispers, "You're needed." The next morning, he walked into the center early. The halls were mostly empty, except for the janitor and a sleepy teenager scrolling through his phone. Shaq went straight to his office and pulled open the top drawer of his desk. Inside was a shoebox, labeled before. It held things he rarely looked at. Old letters, childhood photos, faded Polaroids from forgotten nights. He rifled through until he found one. A picture of him, young, shirtless, sitting on the hood of a friend's car, smiling. Next to him, a woman in a dark denim jacket, smiling wide, one hand on her belly. He stared at the picture for a long time, then flipped it over. No name. Just a date. 25 years ago. He sat back staring at the ceiling, as the puzzle began to rearrange itself in his mind. Maybe Delilah wasn't the woman from the past. But what if that woman had a child, and that child had Sophie? It was a stretch, a long shot. But the resemblance, the instincts, the pull, they couldn't all be coincidence. And maybe it didn't matter in the end. Maybe what mattered was what came next. There was a soft knock at his office door. He turned, and there she was. Sophie, notebook in one hand, red bow in her hair, shoes slightly mismatched, eyes looking up at him with no hesitation. She held out a new drawing. This time, it was a house. A tall man stood outside the door, arms wide open. A little girl ran toward him, the wind in her hair. Above it, one word again, bigger this time, clearer. Home. Shaq took the paper, nodded once, and smiled. Not because he had the answers, but because he was finally ready to look for them. She hadn't planned on staying late. Sophie had already fallen asleep in the children's reading nook with her notebook clutched against her chest, and Shaq had offered to wait until Delilah finished logging her final documents. But something tugged her back into the filing room, something deeper than paperwork. The box in front of her was from her mother's old storage trunk, the one she'd inherited after the funeral but hadn't dared unpack fully. It had traveled with her through 3 apartments, 2 job losses, and a pregnancy she hadn't prepared for. Inside were wrinkled photos, expired IDs, old keys to places that no longer existed, and beneath all of it, tucked beneath the worn folds of a yellowed envelope, was a letter she didn't recognize. It was handwritten, the ink slightly smudged from what looked like teardrops. Delilah turned on the desk lamp and carefully unfolded the page. "Shaquille, if you ever read this, please know I wasn't trying to punish you. You were young, and so was I. But after that night, I knew the kind of life we were headed toward, full of cameras, distance, whispers, and the weight of a name too big for us to carry. I made a choice I thought was best. I left, not because I didn't care, but because I was afraid. I had a baby. I raised her alone. I don't expect anything from you. Just, maybe someday, if paths cross, you'll understand why I did what I did. I hope you became the man you were trying to be that night. Elena." Delilah's breath caught. Elena. Her mother. She read it again, this time slower, feeling the words twist around her gut, like roots growing through gravel. She remembered hearing stories of her mom's younger days, about how she'd worked briefly at a recovery center in Westlake when Delilah was just a toddler. She'd mentioned meeting someone kind, someone tall and thoughtful. Delilah had never thought much of it, just another passing chapter in a book her mother never finished. But now her fingers trembled as she read the name again. Shaq. She thought of Sophie's drawings, always the same figure, tall, broad, skin always shaded in dark brown, eyes soft. The man never had a name in the pictures, but always the same gentle smile, the same presence. Delilah stood up abruptly, pacing the small office. Her mind raced. Could it be that her mother had known this Shaq? But that didn't make sense. The timelines were off. Shaq would have been barely 20 then, and he never mentioned working at a rehab center. He was already on the verge of national attention. Could there have been another man with the same name? The possibility seemed absurd at first, but Sophie's connection to Shaq wasn't random. It wasn't just a child's misidentification. Delilah had seen it, in her daughter's eyes, in her body language, in the way her silence broke like a dam, the moment she touched him. Something deeper was at play here. Delilah turned to her phone, hesitating. Then she pulled up the county records database and searched Shaquille O'Neal, Los Angeles, Fawn 1999, 2005. Dozens of results. She narrowed the filters, add in employment, and rehabilitation center. One hit. A man listed as Shaquille O'Neal, former counselor, no relation to the celebrity, mugshot attached, same skin tone, similar build, but the eyes were wrong, cold, flat, a past record of domestic violence and substance abuse. Her stomach turned. Was this the man her mother had known? Or run from? She closed the screen and leaned back, a sense of unease crawling beneath her skin. This wasn't just about coincidence anymore. This was starting to feel like a trail that someone, maybe even her mother, had hoped she'd one day follow. Behind her, she heard a soft yawn. Sophie stood at the door, rubbing her eyes, notebook still tucked under her arm. She looked at Delilah, with the sleepy gentleness only children possess, then walked over and climbed silently into her lap, resting her head against her shoulder. Delilah stroked her daughter's hair, mind still swirling with what she'd read. "You okay, baby?" she asked, kissing Sophie's forehead. Sophie didn't speak, but she pulled out her notebook and flipped to a fresh page. She drew the same man again. This time he stood in front of a doorway, arms open. But beside him she drew Delilah, and herself. The three of them, holding hands. Above them, one word scribbled unevenly. Whole. Delilah swallowed the lump in her throat. Whatever this was, blood or not, Sophie had found something in Shaq. A safety, a belonging, a warmth that had been missing for so long. The next day, Delilah walked into Shaq's office after hours. He was alone, reviewing budget proposals, glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. "Got a minute?" she asked. Shaq looked up, surprised but not displeased. "Always." Delilah sat down across from him, placing the letter gently on the table. He read it without saying a word. When he reached the end, he looked up slowly. "Elena?" "My mother," Delilah confirmed. "I found it last night. I think she meant to send it to you." Shaq leaned back, processing. "I knew someone by that name. Years ago. But I thought she left the state." "She did, for a while. But she came back, got sick, passed last year. She raised me alone." Never talked about my father. Not really. I didn't ask. Shaq's voice was quieter now. And you think I don't know what I think, Delilah interrupted gently. That's the honest truth. The timelines are close but off. You and I, we never met before this. I'm sure of it. But my mom, maybe. And Sophie, she feels something with you. Something real. Shaq turned to the window, staring out at the playground where the kids had left chalk scribbles on the sidewalk. I don't know how to explain it. When she hugged me, it felt like déjà vu, but deeper, like I was remembering something I hadn't lived yet. Delilah's eyes filled, but she didn't let the tears fall. I'm not asking for anything. No tests, no labels. But I had to tell you, because whatever this is, Sophie's never opened up like this. Not to anyone. You've unlocked something. And I think she needs you, whether this is fate or just strange magic. Shaq looked back at her, nodding slowly. She calls me Dad, but it ain't about what happened years ago. It's what's happening now. They sat in silence. The air was thick with things unsaid, but also comfortingly full, the way two people feel when they both finally stop pretending they're fine. Later that evening, Shaq stood alone in the gym, lights dimmed, his footsteps echoing as he walked to the center of the court. He picked up a ball, bounced it once, then twice, let it roll. He remembered his younger self, how desperately he wanted to be seen, to be known for more than size or stats, how deeply he craved connection, but couldn't admit it. And now, this little girl had looked up at him, without fear, without doubt, and given him the most sacred title he'd never earned. He didn't know what the truth behind the past was, but he knew the truth of now. And maybe that was enough. In a quiet moment before closing, Sophie ran onto the court barefoot, her notebook in hand, and held it up to him. He bent down, took it, and flipped to the newest page. This time, the drawing showed Sophie with a balloon. The balloon had words inside. My voice. She had drawn herself handing the balloon to Shaq. Beneath it, just 3 words. You kept it. Shaq closed the notebook and smiled, eyes wet. Sometimes the past doesn't need to be solved. Sometimes it only needs to be honored, through presence, through kindness, through choosing to stay. And as he lifted Sophie into his arms and walked toward the bleachers, he realized something. He didn't need to know where he fit into her story, because wherever he stood, she had already placed him at the center. Sophie sat just a few feet away, her notebook resting on her knees. Her red bow tilted slightly to one side, and a trail of green crayon marked the corner of her cheek. She wasn't drawing Shaq today, not yet. Anyway, today she drew stars, tiny ones, scattered across a page, none of them touched, but all seemed to orbit something invisible at the center. Shaq watched her quietly, leaning back on his hands, his gaze distant but soft. She hadn't spoken since their moment in the gym, but she'd stayed close. Wherever he went, she'd appear minutes later, sometimes holding her notebook, sometimes just sitting silently near him. No demands, no explanation, just presence. He let the silence stretch. You ever get tired of the quiet? He asked her gently. Sophie didn't look up, but the crayon paused in her hand. I used to, he continued, shifting his weight. When I was your age, I hated silence. It meant people weren't looking, weren't listening. I was always the biggest in the room, but somehow still invisible, unless they needed something. Sophie resumed drawing. You see someone my size, and you think strong, tough, protector. You don't think scared, sensitive, soft. But I was all of those things. He picked up a toy block, spinning it between his fingers. My mom told me once, you don't need to be loud to be heard. You just need to be real. Took me a long time to understand that. Took me even longer to stop trying to prove I deserved to be heard. Sophie put down her crayon and looked at him. Their eyes met. You don't have to talk, little warrior, Shaq said, his voice almost a whisper. I see you. Something in her eyes flickered. Not a spark, not a tear, just a softening. She scooted closer, closing the distance between them, until her small hand rested gently against his chest, right over his heart. Her fingers were warm. She didn't press, just touched. Shaq placed his hand over hers. Neither of them moved. Later that evening, after Delilah had picked up Sophie and Shaq had locked up the playroom, he wandered into his office and sat in the dark, replaying the moment in his mind. He thought about all the times he'd filled silence with noise on courts, in interviews, at charity galas where applause meant more than connection. This silence, Sophie's silence didn't feel like absence. It felt like trust. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, pulling a small notepad toward him. He wrote something on the first page. To be seen is the beginning of healing. He stared at it, then flipped the page and wrote another. She doesn't need words to speak. She needs room to exist. The door creaked open. Delilah stepped in, holding Sophie's notebook. She wanted you to have this, she said. Shaq stood up slowly, surprised. Everything okay? Delilah smiled. Tired but sincere. Better than okay. She wanted you to see what she drew. Shaq took the notebook with both hands and opened it. The page was simple. A figure, tall, brown, broad-shouldered, standing next to a small girl in a red bow. But this time, the background was different. The figure wasn't a stranger anymore. His face was clearer, detailed, familiar. Underneath the drawing, written in unsteady slanted letters, was a single word. Dad. Shaq's throat tightened. She drew that before bed, Delilah said, watching him closely. Didn't say a word, but she handed it to me, pointed to your picture, then to the word. That was it. Shaq nodded, eyes still on the drawing. She's telling us something. I think she's been telling us for days, Delilah said gently. We're just finally listening. He closed the notebook and held it against his chest. I don't want to confuse her. I'm not trying to step in where I don't belong. Delilah walked closer. You didn't step in. She invited you. Shaq looked up at her, something unreadable in his eyes. What if I let her down? Delilah's voice didn't waver. Then you'll show her what it looks like to get back up. That matters more. They stood in quiet understanding for a moment. No need for titles. No need for certainty. Just the acknowledgement that something sacred was unfolding between them. Fragile, unplanned, but undeniably real. In the days that followed, Sophie's presence around Shaq became a quiet constant. She didn't speak. She didn't always smile. But she watched him with the calm certainty of someone who felt anchored. When he read to the kids during story time, her eyes never left his face. When he passed by the art station, her notebook always seemed to hold a new drawing with him somewhere in the scene. Sometimes holding her hand, sometimes just standing nearby. One afternoon, as the kids prepared for a field trip, Sophie lingered behind, reluctant to get on the bus. Something wrong? Shaq asked, kneeling beside her. She handed him a note, 3 words, written in careful print. Will you come? Shaq smiled, wide and genuine. You bet I will. On the trip they visited a local wildlife preserve. Sophie held his hand the entire time, guiding him from enclosure to enclosure like a silent tour guide. At one point they stopped in front of a tall aviary. Inside, birds flew in slow, looping patterns. Did you know, Shaq said, crouching to her level, that some birds don't make any noise at all? Not because they can't, but because silence is their instinct. It keeps them safe, but when they do sing, it means they feel at home. Sophie watched the birds, expression unreadable. Then she leaned against him, her head resting against his shoulder. When they returned, Delilah was waiting. Shaq lifted Sophie down gently from the bus. She turned back to him, paused, then reached into her backpack and pulled out another notebook page. This one had just a drawing of 2 hearts. One large, one small. They overlapped. The lines intertwined. Between them, in her now familiar shaky script, she'd written,
Made of air, but always there.
Shaq blinked back the burn in his eyes. That night, as he sat in his apartment, the drawing on the table beside him, he finally allowed himself to believe that maybe what they were building wasn't pretend, it wasn't confusion, it wasn't projection, it was a connection without definition, a bond without explanation, a kind of love that didn't ask for permission. It just grew, quiet and strong like roots beneath concrete. He picked up the phone and called Lucille. She answered on the second ring. You alive? Yeah, he said. Very. She paused. You sound different. Shaq nodded to himself. I think I am. Good. She replied. That little girl still holding your heart hostage? He laughed. No. She gave it back. With interest. Lucille didn't press further. She just said, then stop questioning it. Just be who she sees when she looks at you. Shaq stared out his window, the city lights flickering like distant stars. Maybe that's what fatherhood really was. Not biology, not history, but being the person someone needed you to be, consistently, quietly, fully. Not made of armor, made of air. And still, somehow, strong enough to hold a child's world together. The week started with a softness Shaq hadn't known in years. Sophie smiling more openly, her hands slipping into his like it belonged there. Delilah looking less guarded in the hallways, even pausing to share inside jokes with the other staff during breaks. For a moment it felt like a rhythm had taken hold, quiet and promising. Shaq found himself humming as he walked the halls of the Jefferson Heights Community Center, giving out nicknames to the kids, laughing with janitors, showing up early to unlock the doors just to see Sophie's face light up when she entered. But peace has a way of stirring envy in places you never expect. It started with a glance. A pause. A shift in energy. The kind of thing you don't catch unless you've been burned by it before. Her name was Miriam Parks. A new volunteer, mid-40s, recently relocated from Sacramento. She had a polished politeness, and the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She'd been working the front desk during morning shifts, and had taken a quick liking to the routines of the center. But there was a sharpness in the way she observed things, as though she was always collecting puzzle pieces no one asked her to gather. She noticed Sophie first. How the little girl would trail behind Shaq like a shadow. How she never left his side during reading time. How her face shifted from withdrawn to bright the moment he entered a room. She took note of Delilah too. How often her lunch breaks aligned with Shaq's. How her desk faced his office window. And she started talking. First to the older volunteers in the lounge. Subtle, almost performative innocence in her tone. "I don't want to start anything," she'd say, sipping her tea. "But doesn't it seem a little unprofessional?" The questions spread like ink and water. Conversations paused when Shaq entered. Delilah started noticing people glancing down. When she passed by, a chill began to settle into what once felt like a warm place. Then came the message on the community center's general email inbox. Sent anonymously, it linked to a gossip blog, with a grainy photo of Shaq walking with Sophie on the playground. The headline read, "Big Shaq's secret daughter? Inside the rumors of a hidden family." The post was speculative, half of it filled with assumptions. It questioned if Sophie was the result of an old affair. Wondered about Delilah's mysterious past. And though it never outright accused either of them of wrongdoing, the tone was enough to cast shadows where none had existed. By midweek the board called a meeting. It was phrased as routine, but Shaq had been around long enough to know when a routine meeting came with too many clipped syllables and sidelong glances. "It's just with your profile," one board member said, his tone careful, "and the media sensitivity around children, we have to be cautious. Optics matter." Shaq folded his arms, his voice steady. "You think I'm exploiting her?" "No one's saying that," another added quickly. "But there are questions about the nature of your connection. Her mother's employment. The photos." Shaq exhaled, slow and deep. "She's not my daughter, biologically, but emotionally," the first board member asked, not unkindly. Shaq's silence answered for him. After the meeting he found himself walking slower through the halls. He stopped reading aloud during story time. He pulled back from the playroom. He didn't want Sophie feeling the shift, but she noticed anyway. Her drawings changed. The space between the two figures grew wider. The smiles faded. She stopped bringing him pictures, and she started sitting alone again. Delilah caught the shift immediately. "You're pulling away," she said one afternoon, confronting him in the break room. "I'm protecting her," Shaq replied, trying to sound resolved. "No, you're punishing her," she said, not flinching. "She doesn't understand board meetings and headlines. She understands presence, and you're taking that from her." Shaq looked away, jaw tight. "It's complicated, Delilah." "So what?" she said, stepping forward. "Everything worth loving is." He didn't have a response. Not a clean one. That night, Delilah sat with a cup of coffee at her kitchen table. Sophie asleep in the next room. She pulled out her laptop and reopened the public records site. Something had been gnawing at her, ever since she found that old letter from her mother. A name without a face. A story missing too many pieces. She ran the search again. Shaquille O'Neal, Los Angeles County. 2 matches. One was obvious. The man everyone knew. The other was buried deeper. Shaquille T. O'Neal. Born in 1976. No relation to the basketball icon. Criminal history. Former rehab counselor. Fired from 2 facilities. Arrested in 2003 for domestic battery. Released in 2005. Address once listed in Compton. Delilah felt her breath catch. She requested archived employment documents through an old state HR portal. A few hours later, a PDF arrived. Among the scanned files, a photo ID, her mother Elena Carr, listed as administrative assistant at the same rehab facility where Shaquille T. O'Neal had once worked. Same year Delilah was born. She stared at the screen, her chest sinking. That was the man. The one her mother had run from. That was the truth her mother had protected her from all these years. Not to erase it, but to rewrite it. Sophie hadn't come from someone kind. She came from someone dangerous. And her mother, in an act of radical love, had built a life away from that danger. She gave Sophie Delilah's name, her home, her heart, and in return Sophie had built her own world. One where safety wasn't tied to blood, but to feeling, to Shaq. The next morning, Delilah walked into Shaq's office before hours. She closed the door behind her, her face pale but resolved. "I know who he is," she said. Shaq blinked. "Who?" "The other Shaquille O'Neal. The one my mother meant. The one she left." She placed the printed record file on his desk. Shaq read through it slowly. His expression hardened as he took in the charges, the dates, the photo. "That's not me," he said softly. "I know. But it might have been the reason Sophie called you Dad." Shaq looked up. "She sees the version of a man she never had. The one my mother never had. She saw it before I did. She chose you, not because of a name, or confusion, or some accident of fate, but because you felt like everything we both hoped a man could be." Shaq swallowed hard. "And now I'm pulling away." Delilah nodded. "You are." He ran a hand down his face. "I didn't want to drag her into my mess. She was already in it," Delilah said. "But she had you, and you made her feel like the world wasn't something to survive, but something to belong to." They stood in silence. Then she added, softer, "Please come back." That afternoon, Sophie sat alone at the arts table, flipping through a blank notebook. The other kids were running around outside. She didn't want to go. Her drawings had stopped making sense. Lines that led nowhere, colors bleeding over each other. No figures, just shapes. Shaq walked in, hands in his pockets. Sophie looked up, then down again. He sat beside her. "I've been thinking," he said, voice low. "Maybe sometimes grown-ups mess up too. Maybe we don't know how to stay when things get loud. But I'm here now, if that still means anything." Sophie didn't move, but she slid the notebook toward him. He opened it. A single page, a single drawing, a broken heart. But this time, two hands were holding it together. Shaq exhaled, then smiled. "You kept me in it. Even when I stepped out." Sophie reached into the crayon box, picked the brown one, and without looking up, drew the tall figure again. Closer now, next to the girl in the red bow. The space between them gone. Delilah watched from the hallway, her chest full of relief and something like awe. She knew there would still be whispers, but the reverberations of what they'd built here, this trust, this bond, would outlast the noise. Sometimes, love doesn't come wrapped in clear lines. Sometimes it's born in rumors, rewritten in records, and felt deepest in reverberations that echo not in words, but in silence that finally feels safe. Shaq sat with his elbows on his knees, eyes locked on the white tile floor. He wasn't nervous in the usual way. He wasn't afraid of needles or the result itself. What twisted in his gut was the knowledge that someone in that room, maybe everyone, was about to get an answer they weren't sure they wanted. Delilah sat across from him, hands in her lap, fingers clenched so tightly they'd gone pale. Sophie was between them, her red bow a little crooked, her notebook resting on her thighs. She wasn't drawing, she wasn't humming, she was just sitting there, head slightly tilted, watching them both with the calmness of someone who already knew what the adults couldn't admit to themselves. Shaq had been the one to suggest the DNA test, not because he wanted to prove something, but because the questions were starting to echo too loudly in other people's mouths. Whispers had power, enough to fracture the fragile thing they were building. The test was supposed to settle it, to create space again for Sophie to just be a child, and for Shaq to stand beside her without wondering if he was standing in someone else's place. Delilah had agreed, reluctantly. She hadn't spoken much that day. He'd noticed how she looked at Sophie when they arrived, like she was memorizing her in case something irreversible changed. She feared a wall being built between them where none had been before. The nurse called their name. Inside the clinic, everything was as neutral and impersonal as expected. Shaq sat on the edge of the examination bed, while Sophie was gently swabbed. She didn't flinch, didn't smile, just stared straight ahead. When it was his turn, he leaned forward, mouth open, the swab brushing his cheek without resistance. He kept his eyes on Sophie the entire time. She didn't blink. The samples were sealed. The nurse said it would take 48 hours. They walked out in silence. 2 days passed slowly. Shaq kept his distance, unsure if presence would feel like pressure. Delilah worked shorter shifts, and Sophie seemed quieter again, though never withdrawn. Just watchful, waiting. On the day the results came in, they returned to the clinic together. This time, no one spoke during the drive. Shaq's hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly. Delilah watched the city blur by the window. Sophie sat in the back, legs swinging, her notebook untouched in her lap. They were called in without ceremony. The doctor sat behind a desk. A man with a neutral face perfected over years of delivering every kind of result imaginable. He looked from the papers to Shaq, then to Delilah. "There's no biological match," he said plainly. "Shaquille O'Neal is not the biological father." It was the kind of silence that doesn't settle. It lands sharp, jagged, splinters into breath. Delilah closed her eyes, just for a moment. Shaq didn't move. Not a twitch, just a slow inhale, like preparing to carry something heavy without complaint. Sophie looked at them, then looked at the doctor, and as if something inside her had been waiting for that exact moment, she stood up from her chair, walked to the center of the room, turned to face them both, and spoke. "Don't go, Dad." Her voice, clear, certain, louder than the whisper she'd first gifted him weeks ago, sliced through the space like light through thick curtains. It was the first time she'd strung more than one word together since her voice had returned. It wasn't fear in her tone. It was pleading, declaration, truth. Delilah covered her mouth with one hand, her shoulders shaking. Shaq's eyes filled, but he didn't look away. Sophie stepped toward him and reached for his hand. "You're my dad," she said again. "I don't care what that paper says." The doctor, caught somewhere between stunned and moved, gently excused himself from the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving just the three of them in the truth. Shaq dropped to one knee. "You sure about that?" he asked, voice rough. Sophie nodded, then threw her arms around his neck. He held her, not like he might lose her, but like he finally knew he never would. Delilah crouched beside them, her hand on Sophie's back, eyes locked with Shaq's. She didn't need to say anything. Everything was already written in the way she looked at him. Relief, love, and a question answered, not by genetics but by something deeper. Later outside the clinic, Sophie skipped slightly ahead on the sidewalk, humming again. Shaq and Delilah walked behind her. "So, that's that," Shaq said, trying for casual. "That's that," Delilah echoed, the weight of the week finally starting to lift from her shoulders. "You okay?" he asked. She gave him a long look. "Yeah. Are you?" He nodded slowly. "I was scared. Not of the answer, but of what it would change." "And now?" she asked. "Now I know it doesn't change a damn thing." That night, back at home, Shaq sat on his couch. Sophie curled up against his side watching cartoons. Her drawing sat on the coffee table, the one she made the night before the results came in. He hadn't understood it at the time, but now it made perfect sense. Two figures, one large, one small, inside a circle. No label, just warmth. And underneath, one sentence, carefully written in her best print. "Chosen is stronger than born." Shaq looked down at her. "Hey," he said softly. "What made you speak again?" Sophie blinked up at him. "You didn't talk to my mouth. You talked to my heart." Shaq closed his eyes, took a breath, and for the first time in years, he let a single tear fall, not out of grief, but because somehow, against all odds, this little girl had found a way to love him into a better version of himself. There was nothing left to prove. No test, no DNA, no headline. Just this moment. Just her hand in his. Just the sound of his name, redefined not by biology, but by belief. "Dad." A young black teenager had been detained the night before, handcuffed outside a corner store after being mistaken for someone else. The incident was caught on video, shared across feeds, watched millions of times. The boy had done nothing wrong, but his skin had spoken before he could, and now the neighborhood had answered. The protest had begun peacefully, signs raised, voices steady, "Justice for Darnell. We matter. Stop seeing us as threats." Young and old, teachers and bus drivers, Parents and kids, all shoulder to shoulder. What was usually a street of food trucks and after-school foot traffic had become a battleground of truth versus perception. Inside the community center, the atmosphere was taut. Staff members had closed all side doors, ushered children indoors, and locked the main entrance as a precaution. Shaq stood in the hallway, arms crossed, scanning through texts on his phone from board members begging him to stay out of it.
Visibility's tricky right now, one had messaged.
You don't want to be the face of a conflict. Think optics. But Shaq didn't care about optics. He cared about his people. And his people were outside, demanding to be seen. Still, he stayed inside. If only for now. Not because he was afraid, but because Sophie was in the building. She was in the arts room with Delilah, coloring quietly, unaware of how close the world was to fraying just outside the windows. But Sophie, even in her silence, felt shifts. Her eyes flicked more often toward the hallway. Her hands trembled as she reached for crayon. She could feel energy change. She always had that gift, sensing storms before they made noise. Delilah glanced toward the hallway again, her nerves fraying. I don't like this, she murmured, watching Sophie scribble faster than usual. It feels like we're on borrowed calm. Across the center, the buzz from outside grew louder. A chant shifted rhythm. A megaphone crackled. Somewhere down the block, a car horn blared 3 times. Short, sharp, urgent.
Then came the snap.
No one saw what exactly turned the protest. Maybe it was a thrown water bottle. Maybe it was panic. But suddenly, the chant broke apart into yelling. Someone screamed. A metal barrier clattered to the ground. Voices turned from rhythm to chaos. And the line between peaceful protest and city flashpoint blurred instantly. Inside, the staff responded fast. Kids were moved into the rec hall. Blinds were drawn. Phones buzzed with news updates. Police deploying units. Crowd movement detected. Center advised to shelter in place. And somewhere in the middle of that panic, Sophie slipped through the side door. No one saw her at first. Not Delilah. Not the volunteers. She had followed the noise. The pull. The invisible tether that tugged at her when things grew too loud, and the people she trusted most stepped out of view. She slipped into the crowd unnoticed, her small frame vanishing between legs and knees, signs and backpacks. She carried nothing but a sheet of paper, a makeshift sign she'd made earlier in art hour. It wasn't political. It was personal. It read, "My dad keeps me safe." Back inside, Delilah turned and realized her daughter's seat was empty. "Sophie," she called, the name catching in her throat. There was no reply, just the rising noise outside. Shaq was halfway across the building when he saw the panic on Delilah's face. "She's gone," she gasped. "She's not here. She's Shaq." He didn't wait. He didn't speak. He just ran. Out the main doors. Into the noise. Into the dust of feet, and cardboard, and confusion. Shaq was a silhouette the crowd parted for. People recognized him instantly, not because of his fame, but because of his presence. He didn't move like a celebrity. He moved like a father who had one mission: find his child. "Sophie," he shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos like a searchlight. "Sophie." People turned, startled. Some stepped aside. Others just watched. Down the block, near the front of the protest where the crowd had begun to clash with a line of officers, a small figure stood frozen, tears streaking her face, her paper sign held high above her head like a shield. Shaq spotted her. She was shaking. He pushed forward. A man tried to stop him, warning of the barrier, of the risk. Shaq didn't hear it, didn't care. He reached her in seconds. Bent down, lifted her up with both arms, held her close to his chest as if he could wrap the world in that one gesture. "I got you," he whispered. "You're okay. I got you, little warrior." She buried her face in his neck, arms locked around him, sobbing not from fear but from release. And then, almost like the universe paused for breath, the cameras clicked. A photographer near the edge of the crowd captured it. Shaquille O'Neal, a mountain of a man, cradling a tiny girl with her hand clutching a sign that said, "My dad keeps me safe." No explanation, no press release, just a moment, just love. The image spread within hours. By nightfall, it was everywhere. News stations, Instagram, viral threads, articles debating whether he was her real father, think pieces about chosen family. Some tried to stir controversy. Others found healing in the visual, a symbol of what love, protection, and fatherhood could look like beyond blood. Shaq didn't respond to any media outlets. He didn't grant interviews. He didn't clarify. He didn't need to. The next morning, the center opened late. Sophie was back in the arts room, scribbling again. The paper from the protest, now wrinkled and stained, was pinned on the wall by her desk. Delilah brought coffee to Shaq's office and sat across from him. "They're calling it iconic," she said. "That photo." Shaq shrugged. "Tired. It wasn't meant to be. I just needed to get to her." Delilah smiled. "And you did." She slid a file across the desk.
"What's this?" he asked.
"Permission form," she said, "for the mentorship program. Sophie wants you listed as her mentor. Officially." He looked at the form, the line labeled name of mentor, and in her handwriting, uneven but certain, one word, Shaq. He exhaled. "You sure?" Delilah nodded. "She is." He signed. By the end of the week, the whispers had changed. No more questions about who Sophie's father might be, just admiration, respect, recognition. Big Shaq wasn't the man with secrets. He was the man who showed up when it counted. A protector, a safe space, a promise kept in full view of the world. Spring had arrived like a quiet celebration in Jefferson Heights. The air was warmer, cleaner, and every corner of the community center seemed to breathe a little easier. A mural had gone up along the east wall, a vibrant painting of children playing beneath tall trees with the words, "You belong here," painted in bold above them. No one said it out loud, but the energy in the building had changed since that day outside with the sign. Since the photo, since the story that wasn't really a story, but a moment that had settled into hearts across the city. And in the middle of it all, Sophie was blooming. She hummed now, not just quietly, but in rhythm. She played with the other kids. She asked for crayons she couldn't reach, and on special days, she would speak a full sentence, just one, to Shaq. Never more, never less. Like she was letting him know that her voice wasn't lost. It was just pacing itself. Shaq had gone from being the quiet protector to a daily presence. He still towered above everyone. But there was something lighter in the way he walked now. He didn't just open doors. He leaned down to listen. He didn't just give advice. He sat through silence when needed. And the program he'd been planning for years, one that had always felt just out of reach, was finally being built. He called it Dads for the Day. The idea was simple: connect children without father figures to mentors who'd be there for moments, both big and small. It wasn't about pretending to be someone's dad. It was about showing up like one, coaching soccer games, helping with homework, going to school performances, reading bedtime stories at weekend camps. It was about presence, not paperwork. Sophie, of course, became the face of it. Her drawing, the one she'd made after the protest, with the sign that read, "My dad keeps me safe," was used as the campaign's logo. The message behind it resonated beyond the neighborhood. Donations poured in. News stations featured them again. But this time, it wasn't gossip. It was celebration. Shaq didn't crave the attention. He kept his head down, focused on the work. But every morning, before anything else, he walked Sophie to her coloring table and watched her settle in like she owned the space. Because in many ways she did.
Then came the offer.
Delilah had been called in for an interview at a prestigious nonprofit across town. Better salary, health benefits, an office with a view. The recruiter had been clear. "You're sharp, grounded, and compassionate. We want someone like you." She came back from the meeting with a quiet weight on her shoulders. She stood at the doorway of Shaq's office, watching him sip coffee and scroll through a roster of volunteer applicants.
"You got a minute?"
she asked. He looked up and nodded. "Always." She stepped in, shut the door behind her, then slid into the chair across from him. "I got offered another job," she said plainly. Shaq didn't flinch, but his eyebrows lifted. "Downtown. Better pay." Whole different world. He waited, not speaking. "They said I'd be helping kids. Structurally. Strategically. I wouldn't be on the ground anymore, not like I am here." Still, he didn't interrupt. Delilah let out a slow breath. "I thought I wanted it. Thought I needed it. And now," she looked at him. "Now I look around here, at the chaos, the crayons, the chipped paint, the random hugs from 5-year-olds, and I realize something. Home isn't always about where you are. It's about who shows up." Shaq's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes softened. "I'm not leaving," she said. "Not because I'm afraid of change, but because this place feels like a promise that kept itself." He leaned back, smiling. Then let's keep building it. The Father's Day event was a month later. The entire center had been planning for it. The hall was decorated with photos of fathers and father figures, volunteers, coaches, teachers, big brothers standing beside kids whose eyes shone with the comfort of being seen. Sophie's drawing was framed on every wall. Her picture, taken mid-laugh with Shaq holding her piggyback, had become the banner behind the stage. It was her first school presentation. A small group of kids were selected to come up and share something about their dad or mentor. Most had memorized poems or short speeches. Sophie had prepared nothing. Delilah hadn't pushed her. She figured just standing on stage would be enough. But when her name was called, Sophie stood. She walked slowly toward the front, small in stature but composed, gripping a folded piece of paper in her hand. The auditorium was full. Families, teachers, local press, and front row center. Shaq sat with his hands folded in his lap, heart racing louder than any game buzzer he'd ever heard in his life. Sophie stepped up to the mic, adjusted it slightly, and without unfolding the paper, she spoke. "I don't know where I came from," she said, voice calm and sure, "but I know who came for me." The room held its breath. My dad didn't find me in a hospital, or from a test, or a paper that said it was okay to love me. She turned slightly toward Shaq. He found me in a hallway, when I was hiding, when I was scared, and he didn't ask for permission. He just stayed. Shaq covered his mouth with one hand. Sophie continued. He never asked me to talk. He just listened to the quiet, and somehow that made me want to speak. She held up the folded paper, then opened it. It was a drawing, a small girl, holding a balloon. Inside the balloon was a name, Shaq. She turned back to the crowd. He didn't give me his name. I gave it to him. The audience erupted in applause. Some were crying, others just smiled through it. Shaq stood, unable to stay seated. Sophie ran to him, launching into his arms, as he lifted her high above the crowd. That photo, the second one to go viral, would later be titled, "The Name She Gave Him." It would hang on the community center wall beside her original drawing, a timeline of love, rewritten in full color. Later that afternoon, after the event, they walked down the sidewalk together. Sophie riding on Shaq's shoulders, the sun cutting through the tree leaves above them. Delilah followed close behind, laughing as Sophie shouted directions like she was riding a royal chariot. "Left, Dad. No, wait, stop. Look, birds." Shaq let her guide him. Always. And as they reached the corner with traffic lights blinking and kids playing on the grass nearby, Shaq turned his head and looked up at her. "You good up there?" Sophie nodded. "Want to get some ice cream?" She leaned forward, whispering near his ear. "Only if you let me pick your flavor." He chuckled. "Deal." They turned the corner and disappeared into the light. Their shadows stretched long behind them. One large, one small, both moving in sync. No paperwork had ever named them for each other. No DNA had tied them together. But the world had watched them choose each other, over and over again. And in that choice, they had built something stronger than a name, louder than silence, and more powerful than any story that had come before. They had built home, together. Some stories aren't just meant to be watched, they're meant to be felt. If this one stirred something in you, you already know why it matters. Because somewhere out there, another child is waiting for someone to stay. Stay curious, stay open, stay human, and when the silence breaks, be the one listening.